Paul Lewandowski, U.S. Army veteran and YouTube host, is joining me now in the studio. Paul, it's a pleasure to have you here in our studio online.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Yes, despite the very heavy blackouts and the problems with the electricity because of Russia, there is nothing will be on our way to deliver the truth to the audience, and it will not stop us from our work. So thank you for joining me, and I'm glad I managed it here in the studio. So, Paul, I recently came across the CNN investigative article, which calls from meat grinder to mopeds, how Russia rethought its war fighting in Ukraine. And it immediately made me stop and think, and probably I hope you're going to help me to clarify a lot of questions that I have after this article. That when we see Russia switching from heavy armor to mopeds, motorcycles, and small buggies, what does that actually tells us about their army right now? Is this a real adaptation or just desperation dressed up as innovation?
So I think there's a really key difference. I think Russia has accepted that there's not going to be a maneuver war victory for them. We see even now in the town like Pokrovsk, where they've been on a 12-month plus campaign to conduct an encirclement, right? Something that is a classic maneuver from armored warfare, where you would see tanks, right, complete that pincer movement and sort of cut off an enemy force. It's really like it's an 80-year-old tactic that's a staple of winning by maneuvering. In a war of attrition, though, all tactics and calculus changes. And so Russia desperately wants to win a maneuver war because it's very, very economically efficient. The problem is that even in a place like Pokrovsk, the Russians still can't actually complete an encirclement. They can't complete that maneuver. So I think for Russia, they have accepted that their only path to victory is through a war of attrition. And when you fight a war of attrition, the primary calculus that you use when deciding to deploy a force, how well to train a force, what to equip them with, is cost. How much does it cost you to field a force? And the truth is, a tank is a very expensive item. Even an old Soviet refurbished tank, as we've seen the Russians rely on in the first 2 years of the war. So those are very expensive to run. They're very expensive to maintain. They're very expensive to train crews to operate. And Russia has looked at the math and said it's better served for us to, instead of spending a million USD to refurbish a tank, it's much better for us to take that same million and deploy it in dozens of drones or hundreds of drones, dozens of small motorbikes, quads, training more poorly trained troops. And so for them, I think that's ultimately the only option that produces any kind of reliable battlefield gains for Russia is simply running the war on the cheapest budget possible that still produces those battlefield effects, those small gains.
Okay, so it's cheaper. Well, that's obvious. Yeah. It obviously is. And also CNN calls Pokrovsk as a symbolic price for Moscow. Why does the Kremlin keep throwing people, as you said, and equipment at towns that are already destroyed and give almost no strategic advantage? Or am I wrong?
No, I think you're largely correct. There was some argument for this defensive belt of cities in the east, but Ukraine has had well over 12 months where it's been apparent that that's Russia's objective, and the way the war is currently fought, broad swaths of open terrain are actually harder for Russia to advance than a city. I think Russia actually found itself in a political tight spot, not necessarily a battlefield one, because in mid to late October, very publicly in a televised, staged managed meeting, Putin was told by his commander-in-chief Gerasimov that Pokrovsk and Kupiansk were completely encircled. Now, the problem is that in a Soviet-style system, when the leadership says that an encirclement is happening, it has to be true. And so the fact that it wasn't true meant that the Russians needed to do everything in their power to make the televised reality actually real on the battlefield. And so if you are Russia, it doesn't necessarily matter. Like Pokrovsk itself, obviously, as you said, is completely annihilated. But they need to be able to sell to their public and to a lesser extent to the international community that they are achieving the victories that they say they are. And I actually have a thesis, though I have, Ukraine would never publicly acknowledge this, that when Russia made that commitment to take Pokrovsk at any cost, Ukraine said, as we say in America, bet, which is to say, okay, if you are going to commit to doing this, we're going to make sure you pay the maximum possible price, right? And so I think it's a politically driven battlefield decision, not one that's driven by necessarily tactical realities.
Yes. And also, evacuations are becoming almost impossible because of the drones. Does this mean that the battlefield has reached a new stage where logistics, not territory, could decide the outcome of everything?
Yeah, if there's one thing that this conflict has shown, it's that the idea of a stable state of the battlefield is just almost never true, right? Every year, the war looks very different. I've seen the same information you have that now medevacs are very difficult operations, but even now we've seen a lot of innovations on both sides in terms of improving those medevac outcomes. We've seen a lot more reliance on UGVs, the unmanned ground vehicles. We've seen increases in UGV armor being piloted. And so, we've also seen the emergence of resupply drones that are dedicated. That's all they do is do resupply runs to positions. And I think, so I'm always reluctant to say this is the new stable situation. But I definitely think it reflects the change from a linear battlefield, right? Trenches facing each other, to this kind of what I've heard called the gray zone. This idea that there are large swaths of the battlefield pockmarked by individual infantry positions, and that those infantry positions are it's less about a creeping advance, like you control this territory, I control this line, and more about almost like ants trying to get into your house, right? It's not like the ants control one room and you control another. It just slowly, you see a slow, gradual increase in the number of ants in a given area, and at some point you say, okay, the ants control this room.
Paul, but just could you please remind me, the gray zone and the killing zone, what is the difference?
Sure. So when a kill zone, at least in NATO doctrine, is a deliberate piece of territory that is essentially constructed to be a trap, in which you wait for enemies to enter it, and then you use your firepower to inflict maximum casualties. Again, a good example would be a big open field where Ukrainian drone teams expect Russian troops to pass. They see the Russian troops in the open. They strike them with drones. That's a kill zone. The gray zone seems to be a different sort of battlefield configuration, a concept entirely, in which there is areas in which no side has decisive control, that has an overwhelming number of drones, continually observed by drones, essentially. And infantry exist in tiny bunkers, in tiny concealed positions where they essentially are trying to maintain some sort of foothold in that area, despite kind of the wide presence of drones. And there's large areas in which control is maintained entirely through drones, in which there are no known infantry positions. And so it's called a gray zone I think in part because there's a lot of unknowns within it, right? So an area on a commander's map may say, oh, there's no enemy here, and that could be untrue. They could say, oh, we think there's a lot of enemy here. Well, that could also be untrue, right? It's kind of like a fog of war in which no side really can say decisively that they or the other side has control.
Yeah, I've heard about the gray zone when in 2022 Russians were near Kyiv, and somewhere in the suburbs where Irpin and Bucha, there were kind of a gray zone. It's supposed to be, as the military said, but then a lot of people have died from Ukrainian and Russian side on that gray zone. So it just, I just recall that moment. And also, speaking about Pokrovsk, lots of analysts stressing that Pokrovsk is not Bakhmut. And also, I found in the CNN article I mentioned, there is a quote. In Bakhmut, the Wagner Group would send personnel out in the open to draw Ukrainian fire, expecting them to be killed. Now the intent is for as many of these personnel to get close to Ukrainian positions as possible. They are not being sent out in order to be killed.
Yeah, I think that's true. That sounds true. I think the distinction, it's probably a difference without a distinction. Because again, if the Wagner Group troops advanced without encountering Ukrainian positions, then they would say, oh, we've taken this territory. We've infiltrated this city block or this building. And if these infiltration troops encounter a Ukrainian position, then drones will strike it and eliminate it. And so, again, I think it's a small difference without a meaningful distinction. I have heard that some of these Russian infiltration troops are told, hey, advance to a certain point, and then we want you to dig in, which was sounded like probably not something the Wagner troops were told as explicitly. But again, I think really in terms of the battlefield experience or the actual execution, I think there's no meaningful distinction. I think all that's happened is that those tactics have gotten refined, but they haven't fundamentally changed in character.
But Paul, looking at Pokrovsk and Myrnograd today, does it still, from your perspective, make military sense for Ukraine to hold the cities to the last?
No. I mean, the short answer is no. There's nothing that I see that necessitates holding this to the last defender. I think I look at more Toretsk as a model for these kind of battles, in which there is a sense that, hey, the Russians are going to advance. We are going to not necessarily try to retake the city, but we are going to make it as costly as humanly possible to do so. And, taking Toretsk was something like an 18-month Russian campaign. You saw when there would be buildings that could be used as effective cover, Ukrainian forces would just flatten them, forcing the Russians to be exposed whenever they advanced. So that, I think, is a better model for fighting in these urban centers. Again, the problem with the gray zone is that no one, and perhaps not even Ukrainian command or Russian command, actually knows how many troops are inside those pockets. Who holds a position, who has or hasn't withdrawn. I think there's a lot of unknowns about sort of what happens inside those pockets, and if this even is a defense to the last man, or if that's even like a viable strategy or a strategy that the Ukrainians are pursuing.
So basically, Pokrovsk is more symbolic value to Russia rather than to Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's true. Again, I can't speak to the mindset of the Ukrainian high command, but what I can say is that Russia publicly committed itself to taking Pokrovsk, and so it has to make that true for internal political reasons.
But also, Russia is still attacking along the Kupiansk and Zaporizhia directions. If they take in all of Donbass is their big political goal, why are they spreading forces elsewhere? I don't know, maybe that's a stupid question, but still I want to know.
No, I don't think it's a stupid question at all. I think the Russian objective is less about seizing the physical territory of the Donbas. Certainly, they're very happy to do so, but I think the real objective for them remains the vassalization of the Ukrainian state. And we've seen this in various Russian statements, the latest of which is their sort of peace proposal that is leaking from that they worked with the U.S. on, in which there's a bunch of conditions that have nothing to do with the Donbas. They involve a smaller Ukrainian army. They involve Moscow getting a sort of veto on Ukrainian international agreements to preserve neutrality. These are all things that are really the wars against Ukrainian sovereignty. The goal is for Moscow to have a military, diplomatic, and economic veto power over anything Ukraine does. That's the objective. And so their strategy to do that is to attrit Ukrainian forces through this continual advances. And so, again, I think for them, the failure in Pokrovsk is just the number of casualties they're going to have to take to achieve that. But they're still trying to they have to push Ukrainian troops continually, because otherwise, if both sides pivot to a defensive posture, Ukraine will continue to reinforce its troops, rotate its troops, strengthen its lines, and it's just something that Russia just can't afford to have that happen really anywhere.
Yeah, speaking about casualties, Ukraine says Russia is losing almost 30,000 troops a month killed and wounded. So you're watching this full-scale invasion for 4 years and maybe this war for more than 10 years. How long can Moscow sustain these losses? Is there any manpower really endless?
I mean, there is no endless manpower. And I think it's less about endless manpower because, Putin could, in theory, activate his reserves, conduct a large-scale mobilization, as he briefly attempted to do early in the war. But that was so unpopular, even among his base, that despite not being a democracy, he still had to back off of it, right? You can still, even a dictator can become so unpopular with his people that he has to answer to them. And so I think there's some signs that the Kremlin recruitment pipeline is cracking because their protocol has been to offer exorbitant salaries to oftentimes poor rural Russian men, oftentimes older Russian men with very limited job prospects, bring them in, train them briefly, and then send them into the fight in these high-risk, high-attrition roles like infiltration, assault. And, we've seen in some regions, Moscow has ramped up its punishments, essentially, to recruiters. There's even been some stories in some regions that recruiters who have failed to meet their recruitment targets themselves are sent to these high attrition units. And that's not something you do if recruitment is going great. We've also seen that the Russian economy is starting to falter and that the Russian state is having to make more and more difficult budget decisions. Notably, they actually expended their entire budget allocation for these combat sign-up bonuses. They basically used 12 months of funds, and they burned through it in like 6 months, meaning that they've had to cut a bunch of those bonuses. So you're seeing these signs also in some of the occupied regions. In Luhansk or Donetsk, the Russian government there has indeed activated, done these large scale mobilizations, drafts essentially, and you look at all those pieces of information, you say, okay, this is not a recruitment pipeline that is sustainable, and that's going great for Russia. Also worth noting is that the secret is out. You can't kill 600,000 people and wound nearly a million, and still try to keep the reality of the war concealed from the Russian public, right? Even with the Moscow's level of control over media in Russia, you still have, you still, a person in a Russian village, they can't miss the fact that so many of their friends' dads have been killed in this war. And so there's a level where no sign-up bonus will get a person to sign up, right? Like if Russia was to offer me $1 million to be on an assault unit, I'd be like, no, I have kids, dude. Like there is no sum of money that will get a certain certain percentage of people to sign up. So, yeah, I don't know if the Russian pipeline for troops is going to collapse imminently, but there's really some signs that they can't sustain this level of attrition for much longer.
Yeah, Paul, you mentioned that there is another attempt to create a peace plan for Ukraine, and something is happening between the US and Russia. And yesterday there was a high military representatives coming to Kyiv, meeting with also Ukrainian authorities regarding this secret peace plan, or maybe it's not the secret, but still we know that we cannot trust Russia, and it looks very cruel amid their attack on Ternopil, killing at least 26 people, 3 kids among them, and dozens of people are not answering their phone, so we are assuming they're also dead. So do you think, why is Russia doing that? You know, we have this tradition that every 6 months Russia is trying to deliver the message to the world that they are somehow agree for a ceasefire, that they are in the process.
Yeah, I think so. I have a couple of theories. One is that it's pretty well known that President Trump, one of his biggest fears is nuclear war. And so Russia has shown that they're very much willing to rattle the nuclear saber in kind of vague ways in this conflict, but never actually seriously like consider that as an option. And so I think in the Russian fashion, targeting somewhere like Chernobyl, a nuclear power site, I think that sort of is helping to play into President Trump's well-documented fears of this, and to sort of push him to be like, oh, you should back this really bad peace deal. The disconnect between Russian actions and Russian statements continues to like awe me. If Russia was serious about peace, then flying drones into Poland and the Baltics, probably not what you would want to do. You probably wouldn't want to violate NATO airspace repeatedly. You probably wouldn't want to have your FSB destroy civilian infrastructure inside of NATO territory. All of these things Russia has done in the last 60 days or so. And so it's really hard to credibly sit there and go, oh, Russia's interested in peace, even as they do everything in their power, essentially, to widen the conflict and pull Europe into it. I never discount the White House's ability to be sort of naive, particularly or willfully blind around Russian intentions. But, as we've talked about, Russia has no qualms about lying in statements, but their actions always betray their real intent. And their actions are pretty clear that they want to continue this war of aggression and they want to expand it. Again, you don't antagonize NATO countries as they have been doing if they want the war to end.
Yes, but at the same time, you said that manpower is not endless. So how can you extend this if you are losing thousands, dozens of thousands on the front line? It's just a mystery to me, to be honest. Maybe in 5 years.
Yeah, it's difficult, but Russia also does a lot of projecting of strength. It's worked well for them so far in negotiations, right? By essentially never changing their stance, they've gotten the U.S. to drop major conditions. In I think it was February or March, the vice president came out and said Ukraine will never be a NATO member, which is a massive concession that Russia was able to extract from the White House in exchange for doing literally nothing. And we've heard directly from President Trump that he feels that Russia is able to continue the war indefinitely. Russia told Ukrainian negotiators that they would fight forever. So that's an important Russian talking point. Again, how long can the Russian government sustain this? How long can they sustain it given their diminishing oil revenues? They can't really take sovereign debt out to fund this war machine. They're raising taxes even as their economy's falling. Again, the actions of Russia are not of a country who is sustaining this war spectacularly. Again, is it going to be, are we 90 days away from economic collapse or Russia running out of people? Probably not. But again, I think we're seeing cracks in the system. We're seeing the pipeline start to dry up. We're definitely seeing the Russian economy falter at a level that we really haven't seen since those first wave of sanctions hit in 2022.
Paul, but the imperialistic regimes, dictatorship, it's falling apart the way you're saying. It's cracking, and then it's happening. Well, at least I believe it's going to happen with Russia as well. My final question, the new, relatively new Pearl system where Europe buys U.S. weapons for Ukraine, and it was presented as an improvement under Trump. Is this actually better from your perspective, military support that existed during the Biden years? Has the type of weapons Ukraine receives changed in a meaningful way?
I can't speak to the exact mix of weapons. I think what's been interesting is that I think we're seeing more and more European-made weapons and more European, we'll say, like experimental weapons being deployed.
Like what?
We're seeing a lot of European-made drones get sent to Ukraine for battlefield testing. We've seen some French air defense systems that have only recently been sort of unveiled, really get their first combat trials in Ukraine. And I think we're seeing more and more of the Europeans slowly shifting to taking over, providing some of this higher tech stuff. Right now, the U.S. advantage is primarily in a select handful of very high-tech systems. And mostly, I really think air defenses, Patriots, things that can take out cruise missiles. And so I think you have I think the Ukraine is less dependent on U.S. weapons. I think the whole technically Ukraine buys them first, or the Europeans buy them and donate them. I think that's a little bit of a shell game. Again, this White House really likes the idea that they're not losing money on a deal. That's
doing
really
business, right?
Yeah. So if that's what they need to do, so be it. Again, the U.S. subsidizes NATO anyway, right? Because our military is part of the defense plan of every other NATO country. So even if we're not literally sending checks, we're still subsidizing these countries that then use their defense budget to purchase our weapons. It's one of those things that is, more of a shell game and more of a performance than it is a real difference. That said, in some ways it's better, because sometimes what the U.S. would send, we'd say, okay, well, we're going to send you these set of packages, and Ukraine's never going to say no. But it's much easier for Ukraine to say, listen, here's the quantities and here's the exact systems we need, and here's the things that we can provide ourselves, and we don't need all that much assistance for.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, to be honest. And I think what I have seen so far, the European countries becoming less and less dependent from the U.S. in terms of, military. It's not, the speed is not fast, it's step by step. But I see that the Great Britain has announced something. They are changing their doctrine. They're just, having these military changes, new production. They're going to have a lot of sites of military production and everything. So, they're just slowly changing their mindset. And yeah, your last point, it's true about that we, we now have a bit different tone with the Washington. We can, afford ourselves to take that tone that, listen, we need this one, but not that one. Yeah, Paul, thank you so much for your time, for all your clarification. It means a lot to me. It means a lot for our audience. And see you next time.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me.